Oh, is that like woohoo, or is it like, oh my God, it's a long L slog? But look at you, you're all nearly, Alissa, they're nearly halfway through, they're nearly finished second year.
It's mad.
Absolutely mad. So everybody, let's welcome Alissa Dunsky. I sent an email to tell you all about her. Absolutely delighted that she agreed to come and talk with you about her own work. So Alissa did the Bachelor in Deaf Studies. She did the interpreting strand. When she was in second year, she did the SCOLS exams and was one of our SCOLS awardees. And she then went on and did a master's in linguistics, and she looked at metaphor in Irish Sign Language. And she very kindly agreed that she would come and talk with you a little bit about that today. So Alissa, without further ado, over to you, and I will be your assistant, Gloria. So I'm
Thank you. Am I able to? Oh, I can share my screen. Okay, brilliant. So thank you very much for having me. I was, well, I will talk about the work that I did, but then when I was putting the presentation together, I realized like there's so much background information that needs to be had to make any sense of it whatsoever. That I'll kind of just present on the background information, and then I'll also talk a little bit at the end about, like, once you have the background information, I'll talk a little bit about the research that I did. So I think I'm doing this right, but I never did it before, so you can see that. Amazing. All right. So today I'm talking about metaphor in ISL. I'll start talking about just talking about metaphor, conceptual metaphor, what that means, and how it connects to the topic of embodiment. I'll talk about metaphor, mapping metaphor, then talking about how conceptual metaphor works in sign language and how you map metaphor in signed language and how it's a little bit different to how you map in spoken language. Then I'll talk about the specific family of metaphors that I looked at for my research, and talk a little bit about what I did. So just to start off, talking about metaphor, I'm sure like you all know what metaphor is. You use one set of terms to describe another, like one set of concepts to describe another set of concepts. And usually like it's used, well, not usually, the way that people are familiar with how it's used mostly is the sort of literary, dramatic. We have the example here from Shakespeare that most people are probably familiar with. You're trying to make it big and you're trying to make a big statement, and it's used intentionally for that effect. But there's another way that we use metaphor every day, all the time, that lots of people aren't as aware of. And that's the idea of conceptual metaphor, where you use concrete concepts and the language of concrete things to describe abstract concepts and experiences. And we use it all the time, every day, nearly in every sentence we speak. And once you're aware of it, you won't stop seeing it, I predict. But a lot of people have just, it just never, it's not that noticeable unless you know it's there. So for example, the metaphor, life is a journey. I mean, maybe you've heard that idea, life is a journey, but the way we speak about that is so common that you might not realize. Like if you say of a young couple, they're just starting out. That's a metaphor. They're just starting out, like, unless they're just getting into the car and leaving the house, like they're not just literally starting out anywhere, but they're starting out on their journey together. So the way we use that kind of language is metaphoric. So you're using the concrete concept of journeys, which we're all familiar with, to explain and discuss the abstract concept of life, which of course we're also all familiar with, but that's like, it's harder to pin down. Like you can't touch life. It's a concept. So you're using the concrete language to speak about the abstract. And these sort of concrete concepts end up being the foundation for these metaphors specifically because they're such universal experiences that we all can share and relate to. The idea of conceptual metaphor is that it's a natural part of conceptual processing, that, you know, like people don't decide that it's going to be a metaphor for, you know, journeys are going to be a metaphor for life. It's like that's the way our brains sort of just understand it and process it without conscious intent, kind of. It'll become more clear. Sorry, I didn't explain that very well, but but I'll explain more and it'll make more sense. So the reason that these concrete concepts kind of map to the abstract concepts is because we share these experiences, these physical experiences. The concept of embodiment is this idea that the physical and sensory things we perceive are linked to the way we process thought and speech. So from early childhood, the way very young babies learn is through their sensory environment. They learn by touching things and putting them in their mouth and being held. And and that's how they initially learn about the world. So that's where we get the metaphors. For example, relationship is proximity. So, you know, if you say we have a close relationship, the idea of having a close relationship means, you know, being deeply connected to someone. The foundation for that is laid in childhood, when that's what relationship is to be held and to be close to a parent or a caregiver. And similarly, the idea of relationship is warmth. So you say we have a warm relationship. It's the same idea, you know, from very young, you know, babies are held and they're kept warm, and that's the sort of experiential foundation for that metaphor. So the foundations of this sort of sensory basis are laid down very, very early. And of course, human beings have human bodies, which might seem like an obvious statement. But the upshot is that we share very, very basic experiences, like moving through space with eyes that face forward. Like we all have that experience, or we know what falling feels like. So if you have an expression like, I'm not falling for that, or he fell into a deep depression, those kind of expressions mean something because we all know that experience of falling. Like we can all relate to that. So that's how the brain like makes a shorthand for expressing something that would otherwise be difficult to sort of conceptualize. We know what catching an object feels like. Everyone knows what catching an object feels like. So you get expressions like, she caught on quickly, speaking about understanding as though it's an object. Or the difference between rough and smooth. So if you said someone is having a rough time, you know, it's not, like, we all know what that means. It's not good. Like someone is having a difficult time, but you'd say they're having a rough time. And these metaphors come from this shared physical sensory experience that we have because we live in human bodies. So because we have these shared direct sensory experiences, it just becomes an easy shorthand for discussing this abstract sort of information. There's an interesting experiment that backed this idea up. It was a very small scale, but it was super interesting. The subjects were given 30 seconds to recall memories, either positive or negative, while they were moving marbles up or down. And when they were asked to retrieve positive memories, they did it measurably quicker when they were moving marbles up. So to track with the metaphor, like good is up and bad is down, people were faster to recall the positive memories when they were moving marbles up and faster to recall the negative memories when they were moving it down, which suggests a correlation between our physical sense of movement and embodiment of up and down and the way our brains process information. And then in the second experiment, they were asked to retrieve memories neutral, like they were given neutral prompts to retrieve whatever kind of memories they wanted. And they were also moving marbles up and down. When people were moving marbles up, they recalled more positive memories. And when they were moving the marbles down, they retrieved more negative memories. So like I said, small scale study, but it was very interesting result that sort of backs up that idea that the way we cognitively process down and up is linked to our embodied experience of those concepts. I hope this is making sense. So when you're describing abstract concepts in concrete terms, you're talking about the target and the source. So the abstract is the target, and the concrete is the source. But if you're going to connect two concepts like that to create a metaphor, they have to have a group of common features. So if we're looking at the metaphor, life is a journey, we have this whole group of features that life and journeys have in common. So this perception of forward motion, you get the expression moving on with her life. People are travelers, he's really going places. Troubles as obstacles, we hit a bump in the road. Divergent plans are divergent paths. She went in a different direction. So you can use all of these sort of journey terms to talk about the experiences of life. And it's a way to make cognitive sense of what is incredibly abstract. So conceptual metaphor in sign language works a little bit differently because there is the added visual dimension. So just to take an example, we have Fergus here signing improve. So this tracks with the metaphor good is up, which in ISL you would have the signs improve, happy, success, achieve, confidence. All of these have the component of upward motion. These are all signs that are talking about something positive, and they'll have an upward motion. And conversely, bad is down. You have terrible, fail, depression, low confidence. So those also all correlate with the idea that negative things move downwards. And there are lots of signs for lots of different conceptual metaphors that have the same kinds of correlation. But when you're mapping metaphor in signed language, it's not as straightforward. So spoken languages, you have one word that does double duty. So you can have a word that means something literal and something metaphoric. The lake is frozen. his heart is frozen. But in sign language, because there's a visual dimension as well, so it's not just the conceptual meaning. Sorry, it's not just the sort of the meaning of the word. It's also there's a visual iconic component to it. So what that means is that you can't just make any sign have any metaphoric meaning, because the iconic meaning might not match the intended metaphoric meaning. So you have to look at the visual properties, the iconic properties, in addition as a second layer, and that's double mapping. So if we take the example of frozen, there's the signs in ISL that you can use to mean frozen. You can use this sign, which the visual sort of iconic properties refer to something that stops in place, like a liquid that becomes solid. Or the other sign you might use is like if you say you're frozen or it's freezing or something. And the visual iconic properties of this sign have to do with shivering. So you have something that stops in place or something that's shivering. But if you say his heart is frozen, you're not saying either that his heart stopped in place or that his heart is shivering. So, I mean, you're saying, you know, he's cold or unfeeling, which certainly this means cold, but the element that's being highlighted is shivering. So you could say that that the iconic properties of both of those signs, just neither of them match the intended meaning of that metaphor. So you wouldn't say his heart is freezing, is frozen, or his heart is frozen, unless you're trying to say, I don't know, he had a heart attack and his heart stopped. You wouldn't say that though. It doesn't match. So that would not be a successful mapping for that sign. So I hope that makes sense. So you have to take the intended meaning of the metaphor and the visual iconic properties of the sign both into account. And if they don't match, then it wouldn't be a successful mapping. So that's not exactly a limitation, but it's a consideration. It's an extra layer of consideration when you're talking about mapping metaphor into sign, and that's called the double mapping constraint. So here's another example. If you say it's pouring rain, what you're talking about is that there's a large volume of water coming from the sky. But you're not talking about, there's nothing there that has anything to say about a container or who's doing the pouring. So what's highlighted there is the volume of water. The ISL sign pour highlights exactly the opposite. It's a container being tipped by an agent, with no specific reference to volume. Certainly volume is implied. You can change the volume depending on what kind of container you indicate, but then, you know, the volume isn't what's being highlighted. It's the container and the hands, the agent doing the pouring. So because what's highlighted in the sign is different from what's being highlighted in the expression, they're not compatible. You wouldn't say it's pouring rain. That wouldn't make any sense. So they do not map, and that's the idea of the double mapping constraint, that there's an extra layer of consideration that has to be taken into account when mapping signs in ISL. So now I'll show you an example of a successful mapping. This is the ISL sign learn. This is drawn from the metaphor ideas are objects. So from this metaphor, we get expressions in English like, do you catch my meaning? Do you get what I'm saying? I made a point and it went straight over his head, as though, do you catch my meaning? As though I've taken my meaning and thrown it to you like an object. So you have the concrete concept of objects, the concrete topic of objects being used to talk about the abstract concept of ideas. So in this sign, so I'll tell you how to look at this table. In the first column, you have a description of all the parts of the body and movements involved in producing the sign. So you have the forehead, the flat palm hand shape, non-dominant, flat palm hand shape, dominant, and then the movement is the flat palm dominant moves towards the forehead. And that's the sign for learn. In the second column, so the first column and the second column work together. The second column describes the iconic mapping, the iconic representations that are made by all of the articulators. So the forehead stands for a container. The non-dominant hand stands for the place where an object is located. This hand stands for a means of moving that object. And then the action describes moving that object from this location to the container. So you're putting something from one location into a container. The third column, the second column and the third column work together. The second column is the iconic description. The third column is the metaphoric description. So the iconic representations stand for these abstract concepts. So the container represents the mind. This location of an object represents new information, or a location where new information is. This means of moving that object becomes a means of acquisition of new information. So you're moving new information from an outside location into the mind. So you can see how, hopefully, the iconic representation has a corollary in the metaphoric representation for each level. And you can see how they just work, they fit together and they work well together. So that is a successful mapping. So you can say the ISL sign learn represents containers being put into an object or information being put into the mind. And that's a successful mapping for the metaphor ideas are objects. Am I going too fast? Okay. So some other ISL signs that map to ideas or objects would be forget, as though, so you could say you're taking an object out of the container and throwing it away. You're taking a piece of information or a memory and it's gone. So forget or dementia, wiping information, wiping something off or getting rid of information. And remember would also map to the same metaphor. Like you have something, an idea or a thing that's located just outside the mind or the brain, and then you're able to pull it back in. So those forget, dementia, remember would also all map to that same metaphor. So that's a very, very brief explanation of conceptual metaphor, how it works in ISL. And I hope that made sense. I feel like it went really fast. But I'll go on now to just talk a small bit about my research, the work that I did. And so I'm going to have to introduce a specific group of metaphors that we all use very, very commonly, which are the event structure metaphors. This looks daunting, it's a lot of words, but really the sort of the takeaway is that this family of metaphors talks about some of the most basic human experiences. They're extremely pervasive in English, very, very widely, well, and as it turns out, not just in English, but certainly English is the language that I assume everyone here is mostly familiar with. Maybe not, but very, very prevalent. Or ESMs, I'll use a shorthand. The ESMs were identified and developed as a concept in the 1990s by George Lakoff and Mark Johnson. And because they talk about such basic concepts that we all experience, Lakoff and Johnson have predicted or projected that the ESMs are universal, which is a big statement to talk about anything in language, but there's evidence already from really very diverse language families, like from English, Chinese, Hungarian, Arabic, ASL, that all have the ESM structures. We all, in all those different, very diverse language families, we use ESLs to talk about the same kinds of concepts. The specific metaphors might be a little different, but the structures are there in all those languages. So if you're claiming something is universal, or not, they're not claiming, but they're projecting that it may be, you can assert that it is, but you can't, asserting or assuming that something is universal isn't any good. Like, you do have to demonstrate it. So I had the idea that I would take a look at, well, sorry, I'll just go back one second. So there's two main branches of the event structure metaphors, and that's the object branch and the location branch. The object branch describes things in terms of objects, all these, like, talking about concepts like events, states, actions, causes, changes, and so forth. Talking about them in terms of objects and the movement of objects. So, the loud music gave me a headache, as though the headache is an object. So that's the object branch, and I didn't look at that one. The location branch describes these basic concepts in terms of locations and movements between them. So if you're saying the clothes on the line went from wet to dry in an hour, you're talking about wet and dry like they're locations that the clothing is moving between. So that's the one that I did look at. And then there's a third one that's been proposed in 2018. Rausch, who did the work on ASL to describe the ESMs, the structures to sort of answer the question is, do they exist in ASL? And the answer was yes. He proposed a third branch, which he called the container branch, because he came up with some basic examples that he felt didn't fit into either the object branch or the location branch. So so for example, the expression "her heart was full of joy" talks about the heart as though it's a container that has volume that can hold something, or he was full of mischief. Really, that kind of expression doesn't necessarily fit into either of the other two branches. And there are other examples of container branch expressions that he documented. So that hasn't been extensively looked at, to my knowledge. But I think, in my opinion, he has a case to make there, so I've included it. But the one that I looked at for my research, I just did a small survey of the location branch in ISL. So in the location event structure metaphor, events are described as movements through space or in relation to specified locations. Obviously, we all exist in space and move through space. It's a very, very normal everyday experience that I think you could say everyone on Earth is familiar with. So it's a good shorthand for, you know, talking about other more abstract experiences. So the location ESM has 11 submappings, but I'm not, so in each one talks about a slightly different way that we talk about events, and there is some overlap, and they work together and intertwine. They're not like completely discrete. There's 11 submappings altogether. I'm only gonna just have a little look at the first 3, A, B, and C, because it's a lot. It's a lot. So I'm just gonna have a look at A, B, and C today, and I will give you some examples. These are some delightful little drawings that I did in MS Paint when I was working on the dissertation, and my brain was like, oh, I can't do this anymore. So I just took a little break with the wonderful MS Paint. So the first submapping, first of the 11 submappings, is states or locations, which refers to specific regions in space that have boundaries. So expressions like I'm in love, or if you can see our little guy in A, he was on the brink of despair. So it's talking about being on the edge of despair, as though despair is a place that you can stand on the edge of. Despair is a location in physical space that you can be on. Obviously, so the concept of being in despair is abstract, and it's hard to conceptualize. So we use this language of despair as a location, as a way to conceptualize it in more concrete terms that our brains can process easier. So then B, changes or movements into or out of bounded regions. So these expressions talk about changes in terms of moving from one place to another. I came out of my depression. So you can see this little fellow climbing out of a deep hole, as though depression were an actual physical hole that you could climb out of. Or he went crazy, talking about crazy as being a place you go to from where you are now. You go to crazy. He went crazy. And the C and D are kind of, they're very, very interconnected. Causes are forces, and causation is forced movement. So the distinction here, the distinction between C and D is it does the effect last for the entire length of the event? So he drove her crazy. If presumably, you know, if they're hanging out and he's driving her crazy, as soon as they part ways, she stops being driven crazy. So she's being driven crazy for the entirety of this event of being together. So then for D, the difference is it's a singular experience that then has an effect that takes place after. So the experience pushed him over the edge. He had this inciting experience that then pushed him over the edge, and the experience is no longer happening, but he's gone over the edge. So the event happens and then the experience happens afterwards. So that's kind of the distinction between C and D. But it's interesting. There's some nuance and gray area, like room for sort of interpretation there, that I find very interesting, that I'll talk about a little later. So these are, I mean, obviously the difference between talking about something as though it's a location you're in relation to versus talking about locations and movement between them, like there's not a huge gulf of difference between those things, but we do have many expressions that sort of talk about them in one way or talk about them in another way. And I mean, I hope this is making sense. There's just all these different ways that we talk about experiences in terms of locations. So I'm going to give an example from my work for submapping B. We saw this sign above, improve. This maps with submapping B, changes our movements. So improve talks about a change in terms of its movement from this point to this point. So this is a change, and we use the language of movement to demonstrate the change. So the articulators are the index finger, the flat palm hand shape, and it starts at the base and moves from the base up. So the iconic mapping is that this is a vertical measure of some kind. This is an indication of the position on the measure. When it starts here, you're talking about the baseline state. And when the sign, you move up and it's showing a change in position from the baseline state. Sorry, hang on just 1 second. I have to. My video camera is a little funky. So you have this, and it's a vertical measure, and you have an indicator of location on the measure. So the target, the metaphoric mapping, is that this represents a range of possible states. The indicator of position on the measure indicates where within this range of possible states you are, or the thing is, or whatever it is. So you're indicating the baseline state, and then this represents a change, a positive change from the baseline. So this also tracks with good is up, as we saw before. So changes are movements. You're showing the change through the movement. So that's an example from ISL for this submapping, changes are movements. Webcam, hang on, sorry. This is a new camera, and it was not cheap, and it has an issue with autofocus and making a clicking noise that I'm trying to address. But when it starts clicking, I have to just stop it briefly and start it again. So, so this is for submapping B. Some other signs that you could say fit the changes in movement submapping would be promote. So you're showing a change through the movement. Pull out, if someone pulls out of an activity or something, the change is indicated through movement. Replace, set up, take over, or like raising a standard or lowering standard. So those signs also fit with this submapping. So then we'll just look at one more. This is submapping D. Causation is forced movement. So this is the second one where you're saying that there's a moment of the event is brief, and then the effects last. So this could be reject either, but in the video that I took this sign from, it was being signed to mean exclude. So you have the fist with the pinky and the flat hand shape, and this is the means of applying physical force, and the direction, the trajectory that you're applying the force, and then the action is that you apply force and push an object away. And the metaphoric mapping is you have the means of excluding someone, the length of the exclusionary act, and you're asserting the exclusion, causing this person to become excluded. So you can see they all match, and that's a successful mapping for this specific submapping. Other signs that would also fit with this submapping would be send, fire, like from a job, or throw out. So the thing that I really enjoy about submapping C and D, how there's kind of nuance, is that there's sort of gray area. So how do you define an action that's limited or sustained? I mean, like I said, these categories aren't, you know, completely separate, and there is sort of room for nuance. But like, if you define something as limited, can you define something as limited if it takes hours to happen, but it only happens once? Like, is that a limited action? Or does an action that takes 5 seconds, could you say that it becomes a sustained action if you did it every once an hour for a week? Is that sustained? Even though the action itself is very, very short. Or you could say that like all actions stop sometime for one reason or another. So aren't they all in a sense limited? Like, can you say anything is sustained if it's eventually going to stop? Or like, for example, I had a couple of weeks ago, I had an absolutely mind-blowingly difficult experience with my mobile phone service provider, and I joked to somebody at the time, like, oh my God, I've gone over, like, this is pushing me over the edge. But the whole experience took 2 weeks to unfold. From the very first moment, it was push worthy. Like I was over the edge from the first moment it started, and then it kept going. So if you see here, like, you know, in the material in Lakoff and Johnson, they're saying, you know, that this maps with have, you know, submapping D, where you're saying it's one event and then the effect happens after. But like my experience with the phone company, it did sustain. So like, I don't know, there's sort of questions of definitions of words and concepts that are interesting to sort of think about. So that's anyway, that's just a very small taste of the research that I did. And based on this very, very small preliminary piece of work, it appears to be that the answer is yes. The ISL does appear to use location ESM structures. So, I mean, it was a fair guess, seeing as they've been shown to exist in ASL and we are related, but you know, you can't just assert that, like. So it looks like, yeah, ISL does use these structures. So the next thing to see would be, does the object branch also use the same structures? I imagine they do, but again, you'd have to demonstrate it. So, and also possibly the container ESM might end up at some stage being looked at in more detail. So that's pretty much it. I have a very, very small sample of references. There's so much interesting writing that's been done on metaphor in general. The first reference here is the initial the initial publication where the idea of conceptual metaphor was initially floated, I think. It was expanded in this book, which is, it's a chunk. That book is large, but it's very, very interesting and not a difficult read. And you can just dip in and out of it. I recommend, if anybody's interested in metaphor, that's a very, very interesting book. And then Rausch wrote about the event structure metaphors in American Sign Language. And Sarah Tao wrote this book on metaphor in American Sign Language, Iconicity and Metaphor, and it's very, very, very interesting. But there's a lot more that's been written, and if anybody's interested, I highly recommend reading more into it. So that's pretty much all I have. I feel like it went fast, but it's been 45 minutes. I hope it made sense. I hope the captions caught me properly. And thank you very, very much for your attention.
So thank you so much, Alissa. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts? Comments? You are going to, we talked a little bit about this very briefly when we introduced the idea of cognitive linguistics, and we talked about embodied experience, right? And we talked about how your body can be a container. So you can do things like to boil and then to have smoke coming out of your ears and that kind of thing. So this was great. This was a really detailed look at, a close-up look at a particular kind of metaphor, and it shows you that, you know, you can really dig down deeper into some of these things. I don't want to say too much. I want to see if you have any questions or thoughts or comments.
I feel like it's the kind of topic that you need to have a bit of a think about before you know exactly what you even want to ask. So I don't know, it's a lot of information.
Mm-hmm.
I just had one quick question. You were saying that you can't really sign a frozen heart as being like heart freeze. How would you sign that then? I was trying to think.
Yeah. Oh, God, I don't
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that you, I mean, I don't know that you would even make use of that metaphor in the same way. Like you might talk about a person as being cold, maybe.
Yeah.
You wouldn't talk about their heart specifically being cold, I don't think. And it's interesting, actually, like for that one, I suppose you would you say like a person is cold? Yeah.
Yeah.
So, which is interesting because you're not necessarily saying that they're shivering. So that's an interesting question. There are probably cases where, you know, you can use an expression that maybe draws from I mean, like there's a lot of influence from English. I don't know, I'm guessing here. I haven't really thought about this. You might sort of leverage an English language expression even if the mapping wasn't perfect. Lorraine, I mean, am I?
Yeah, I don't even know that it's necessarily English influence per se, because for a number of sign languages I know where the dominant spoken language isn't necessarily English, people still talk about a warm person or a cold person.
Yeah.
So I think that that's more fundamental, but I think you're right in terms of it's you know, you can take the principle in some way of the metaphor and you can profile it differently in a target language. So what you need to avoid is the assumption that you take the clause or the phrase as it exists in the source language and that carries across. So the conceptual metaphor, the underlying principle, might still prevail across both languages, you know, around the future motion is moving forward in time, or forward motion rather is future, is at a future point in time, or you know, the past is behind you, or the up is good and the down is bad. Those conceptual principles tend to operate across languages, but how they play out in each language can differ. Yeah, so the words that you put onto it, or the idiomatic constructions or the metaphorical constructions that you use can differ in each language, even though when you pair it back and you think, what's the underlying conceptual structure at play, it's the same ones. So for those of you, like you're all doing translation and interpreting with Sarah at the moment, right? So if you're thinking about how does what we have in language A translate into language B, something that you really need to think about is what is the underlying conceptual structure. And so thinking about things that Alissa has talked about today around, you know, well, are we talking about Are we talking about a continuous event? Are we talking about something that's repeated over time? Is it something that's instantaneous? Is it a cause and an effect? Is it about the relative locations of something versus another? You know, and then is there a metaphorical mapping around something that is high and an emotion that is high? You know, so she was feeling high as a kite. Yeah. You wouldn't say that in ISL, right? But you would want to think about, well, how do I represent that? You'd need to know, what does that concept represent? And then how do you move towards something more or less equivalent in the target language? And it might be that you do it by finding a parallel conceptual metaphor, or it might be that you do it by paraphrasing or by explaining or by finding something completely different. Yeah. So you've got to figure those things out. But the first step for translation, and indeed for interpretation, is being able to identify some of those conceptual underpinnings. And that's one of the things that makes interpreting hard work cognitively. It's the effort piece, right? Because you're doing all of that all the time while you're still making it look easy, hopefully. Any other thoughts? If we had loads of time, what I would be doing is saying, okay, off you go now and see if you can come up with some examples of your own. But you'll have to do that in your own time or with each other. Mm-hmm. Listen out over the next week and think through, you know, have a listen or see when you're in your classes, have a look and think, oh gosh, is that metaphorical? Amelia, you got your hand up there.
Yeah, actually, I was thinking about this while you were presenting. Is there an ISL only metaphor that only exists in ISL and can't be translated into English?
I'm sure there must be. I feel like every language has its particular expressions that just don't translate. I'm not great at thinking off the top of my head like that. Lorraine?
Well, I think if you're talking about those conceptual metaphors, because they're linked to embodied experience, they would tend to have replications at the conceptual level.
Conceptual level, but the specific sort of
across languages, right? But in terms of I'm trying to think, the ones that are coming to mind, I've seen them used in more or less similar ways in other sign languages, you know, so things like meeting of hearts, meeting of minds, you know, the boiling the body as a container, well, because like sign languages, like all languages, are embodied, so it's no surprise that you see, you know, you might see different hand shapes being used. So the expression, the form of articulation would be different. It's quite possible that there are some, but I think it's also fair to say that there hasn't been enough research done and enough documentation done for us to be able to give you an answer. Absolutely. But there are, you know, there are also lexical signs, of course, that are used. So gendered signs, or what have traditionally been gendered signs, that you could potentially see as, to a degree, maybe as idiomatic, but I'd be very cautious about actually saying that, because I think sometimes they're words, and do words have inherent, like as Alissa has shown, you know, words inherently can have metaphoric underpinnings conceptually. So, you know, so it comes back, it's like we're talking, Alissa, at the moment I'm torturing them with figuring out, you know, where are the sentences in a piece of text. Well, you know, another question that you can ask is, well, when is a word a word? When is a word a phrase? When is a word an idiom? You know, is everything underpinned to some degree by conceptual metaphor or by some iconic principle? So it's a tricky one to answer, I think. But great
or
question.
even like I think I saw this once in like first year, but like, you know, like that, like, you know, the expression in one ear out the other, but because they're deaf they want to say like in one eye out the other eye.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But
so
that's
like
not specific, that's not unique to ISL.
Yeah, no, I was, then it kind of brought me onto the thought of like in general, like deaf only.
Yeah. Oh, well, deaf only. Yeah, sure. I mean, there are loads of those ones, you know. So there's also the listen, you know, to take something in by eye, to, you know, to ignore something. Yeah. So you can ignore visually as well as ignore auditorily. As you said, like in one eye and out the other. You know, there's also the, you know, the here's a metaphor that only deaf people will use, and it's to insult another deaf person by calling them hearing. Yeah. So if I saw a full-fledged argument that lasted many months between two deaf people because one called the other hearing, said you're not really deaf, you're hearing. And the biggest compliment then that a deaf person can give you is to say, oh my God, you're deaf. Yeah. Not to mean you're physically deaf, but to mean that you have something of deaf culture, you sign like a deaf person, you engage with the deaf community in a way that's deemed culturally appropriate. So they're metaphoric uses also, and they would be deaf community specific, but not ISL specific. Great questions. These are good. They ask good questions, Alissa.
They do.
So do you deserve a break then? And they're like, yes, please,
Yes,
Catherine.
I do. Thank you for asking.
You definitely deserve coffee.
Oh,
thank you so much, Alissa. We really appreciate it.
I hope it was not too dense. I hope it made sense. Anyway, if anybody has any follow-up questions that they want to ask me, like, I'm happy to get emails or.
Super duper. And your PowerPoint, you'll share a PDF with me so I can put it up on Blackboard.
Yep.
And I can also point you towards Alissa's thesis if people want to read more. And Alissa, you're going to write an article, right?
Yes, I'm working on it.
Excellent. Good job.
Thank you, Lorraine. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you so much. Come back and visit again.
Will do. Thanks. Bye.
Cheers. So, shall we have a 10-minute break after that? Yeah, we come back at 11:10. Super duper. See you in 10. Welcome back. So hopefully your heads aren't still exploding. There's another metaphor for you. And I think I might have. And hopefully it didn't all go over your head. Another one, right? So you see, once you start looking for them, another one, because you're not physically looking for metaphors. But once you have thought about it at all, like literally you find tons and tons of examples coming at you. And there's another one, tons and tons of examples, not literally. So language is very heavily weighed, and there's another one, crikey. There's lots of conceptual metaphor in the languages that you know. So be they signed or spoken, once you step back and start to think about it and look out for them, you're going to see tons and tons of those examples. So have fun with them and try and figure out, well, what kind of a metaphor are you seeing? Are they container metaphors? Are they sort of road or journey metaphors? Are they process metaphors? What's happening when you see them or hear them? And I think, you know, if you put the time in to trying to figure those out a little bit, that actually helps a lot with the way you're thinking about working between languages and how you think more deeply about what goes into ISL. I don't know if I told you this example, but a long time ago, I worked as a house parent in St. Joseph's School for Deaf Boys. And I remember one day having a conversation with one of the teachers in the schools at the time with some of the boys, and the teacher was signing about this new tuck shop, a little school shop that had been established, and the teacher signed, "Now the shop is in operation." That is certainly not a metaphor that carries across Yeah, because what you're talking about is it's established, it's set up, it's ready to go, or it's open, the doors are open, right? So thinking through some of those things and how they operate between and across languages is something really worth thinking about. Now, another thing worth thinking about, and building on where we've come from with respect to talking about sentences in ISL, we also want to move up a level and think about discourse. So I just realized this morning that, oh, we didn't get to talk about passives in any detail, but I have written a paper about this, so I'm going to put the paper up, and a link to the paper up in Basecamp. And we have talked, we talked a little about it at the beginning of the term when we talked about how, last week we talked about actors and undergoers and how generally active transitive sentences are led by the actor, the most agentive-like element, then a verb, and then the undergoer, the most patient-like or affected entity. In passive constructions, what you tend to get is a reversal of that. So what you're finding is that it is the undergoer, the person affected by the action, who is coming first. They're foregrounded in the discourse, in the sentence. So if you have something like, I showed you in week 1, the picture of Eddie, who was talking about being prepped for heart surgery. Remember that story? He had broken his little finger. He went to the hospital. There was no interpreter, and he got prepped for heart surgery. And he does something like this, yeah? So that's his chest being shaved in prep for the surgery. So there we know now, because we talked about body partitioning, we know that this hand in that construction is not his hand, that is somebody else's hand, presumably, a nurse, or I don't know who does these things in hospitals. So, you've got somebody else's hand being active, but the foregrounded bit, most of his body, is being represented by him in another place in time, right? And so we're saying there that the undergoer perspective, Eddie is the undergoer of the experience, and the actor is represented through that partitioning of the hand. So the more active party in that utterance is being represented through body partitioning, and presumably we also have an invisible surrogate there. So you're picturing the event, yeah, but you're just shifting the focus. So normally it's, when I'm acting, my perspective is representing the most agentive, the most actor-like entity. But in passive constructions, that shifts. What you also typically find in passive constructions is a version of eye gaze. So if I have somebody looks at me, yeah, it can be, somebody was staring at me. Because if I do this, well, then it's we're looking at each other. So that's a different kind of construction. That's a reciprocal, where we're both equally acting with respect to one another. Yeah. So you could equally have, somebody gave me a kiss on the cheek. Yeah. But that was something done to me rather than we kissed each other. Yeah. So, and normally eye gaze is then towards the locus for the interlocutor. So that's the difference between reciprocals and passives. Yeah. So, and then there's one more I should mention, and that is reflexives. So we talked last week when we were looking at the transitive utterances, we talked about what do you do if you're brushing somebody else's hair? Yeah. And we said, well, you have to brush your own hair first, so you have a point of reference, and then you do the action of brushing towards an invisible surrogate. So some of those verbs, like the verbs of grooming, we can say that they're inherently reflexive because they're typically things that you do to yourself. And so if you want to make it about you doing it to somebody else, you have to first use the verb in its inherently reflexive form before then moving to mark it as something that you do to somebody else. Okay, so that's like a whistle-stop tour so that we can get to talk about discourse. So let me open this up. So far, so good? Okay, now then, here we So a little bit on discourse and communicative interaction. I'll just bring you along here a little bit more. So, okay. I like this quote from George Bernard Shaw, which is, the biggest problem of communication is the belief that it has been accomplished. Yeah, many of you, well, you're all very young, so maybe you don't, some of you will remember Nelson Mandela and the fake interpreter saga, where we had somebody who was just waving their hands about, and the hearing world believed that this person was interpreting, and somehow they managed to get through security, etc., to stand beside Obama. So there's a clear instance of the problem of communication in the belief that it's been accomplished, right? And this is actually, I think, in deaf studies, maybe you've talked about this a little in deaf education with John Bosco. This is a big problem, because the assumption very often is that somebody who's waving their hands around a little bit or has gone to 2 weeks of signing classes is somehow able to fluently deliver a curriculum to the appropriate level required with the appropriate impact and effect for communicative purposes. And it is not. So we should say that some of where we're going to today now is, just to put this in perspective, last term you were talking about the building blocks of sign languages, the phonetics, the phonology, the morphology. We've taken a little bit from there and we're moving into the syntax and the semantics. When we talk about macro roles, we talk about agents, patients, actors, undergoers, they're all macro roles. So that's semantics. And that is, these are all really thin lines of semantics. People can spend 30 years studying semantics and analyzing things like semantic roles or, metaphor. So we're really taking, it's a very thin introduction to each of these things. Then we talked a little bit now, today what we'll talk about is another supra layer. We're getting to the layer of discourse, but this is also where pragmatics kicks in, right? So we've gone from how do you build a word? So the sounds or the hand shapes that make that up, the movements, the orientations, to how do you put them together? How do you create new words? So things like compounding, things like a spectral marking. How do you build sentences? Your favorite thing in the world. And now, how do those sentences hang together to make discourse? Are there any principles at play? And also what we can talk about then is you can think about how do you analyze that discourse? Yeah, so there's a whole branch of linguistics called discourse analysis. And, if that's a heading, well, then you've got different kinds of discourse analysis as well. But we're not going to go into that in any great detail, other than to say, one of the oldies, but the goodies in terms of giving a good overview of discourse analysis, if you're interested, is Gillian Brown and George Yule. And there are many editions of that book, so there may be a more recent edition. So some of these things you may have come across before, right? So when we're talking about discourse analysis, we're talking about things like speech act theory. Have you heard of that before? I'm going to take that as a no. Okay. Have you mentioned Bill Isham's message analysis? Maybe with Sarah. Yeah, okay. We're going to talk briefly about information structure, okay? And what that means for us. We're going to talk about coherence. It's again, this is probably something that Sarah will have mentioned to you in translation and interpreting. And we're going to talk about a concept called intersubjectivity, which may have come up before in your language acquisition module, particularly when you're thinking about things like theory of mind, and how people develop an understanding that the way they see the world or what they know about the world is not necessarily what you, their interlocutor, knows about the world. So how do you figure out what each other knows, right? So that's something that kids have to learn in order to then develop empathy and to understand, when you go to the pantomime, it's like, he's behind you. It's because I can see that somebody is behind you, but you don't know that they're behind you, all of that stuff. So intersubjectivity sort of builds on that and is embedded in the language that we use, because we talk about language, when we get to discourse, we talk about language as being co-constructed. and meaning being co-constructed. It's not just that, you know, this word contains a meaning. And once you know the meaning of all the words in the language, you know the language. You know that that's not the way it works, right? Because you have learned lots of signs in the language, but it doesn't mean that you fully know all that there is to be known about language X, Y, or Z. So, speech act theory. This comes from a branch of philosophy, actually. So lots of people do linguistics, by the way. You've got like educational linguistics. You've got psychologists who do different kinds of linguistics. You've got philosophers who are interested in the philosophy of language and where thought comes from, and consciousness and the nature of consciousness and how it maps to thought and language. And then you've got, like, in linguistics, you've got tons of different subcategories too. So this guy, Austin Searle, is really famous for speech act theory. And what he does is he says that, well, and this is kind of building on what Alissa has said earlier on, right, that some sentences can describe a state of affairs, others can perform acts. You know, so some things can be transitionary, they can be procedural, some things can be instantaneous, but the way you describe an act is going to tell you something about the act. So, you know, I bet you €10 it will rain tomorrow. Yeah, so that's a state of affairs. I'm engaged in a state of betting you that something will happen. Or, you know, you can perform an act. So I name the ship the St. Patrick, or, you know, I declare you husband and wife. I'm swearing you in as president of the United States. They're all performative acts. And as a result of performing those words, they have some kind of an impact in terms of a change of state. Yeah. So again, there's semantics at play here when we're talking about, you know, change of state, when we're talking about the state of something. And it's not like the state here. I'm talking about, like, you know, is something moving or not moving? Is something changing? Is there a belief held? And how is all of that kind of thought about the world encoded in language, and how does that play out? So you can see there, then you've got things like swearing allegiance, you know, if you're American, swearing allegiance to the flag, marrying, divorcing, so change of states. They're all what we would call prototypical performatives. And they are also known as illocutionary acts, right? So if you go and look at discourse analysis texts, they'll talk about illocutionary acts. Illocutionary acts like these, they also occur in ISL. So we've seen some this morning with Alissa. We've talked about them over the course of this term, actually, in terms of, you know, what kind of a sentence is it? Is it a locative sentence describing the relative position and therefore the state of things? You know, there's, you know, a non-moving entity and a moving entity. They're states, and change of state of one person moves around a rock, that kind of thing. So they're all illocutionary acts. But we have looked really at the sentence level so far. So what happens if we look at the bigger picture? Well, let's add another couple of concepts. These ones are probably originally from psychology. So if you look at, there's a great textbook called An Introduction to Cognitive Psychology. I don't know if you come across it on your reading lists, by Eysenck and Keene. And again, there are probably about 100 million, that's hyperbole, but there are many, many editions of that book, and it is a really good primer to talk about lots of these ideas. Equally, on your reading list, the Introduction to Language, the Fromkin and Rodman book that we've recommended. In there, if you look at the chapter on discourse, you'll find that there's also good descriptions, and with great cartoons, on things like frames and scripts. So let's just say something about these. Have you talked about this with Sarah before? Frames and scripts. Okay, so a frame is, they talk about frames as having a frame of reference for the world that we link new experiences and knowledge into. So, you know, if I said to you, okay, it's a restaurant. Yeah, you're going to a restaurant. You have an idea of what happens in a restaurant. We've probably all forgotten now at this stage because of COVID. But, you know, if I said to you, okay, it's a restaurant or it's a pub, you have an idea of what a pub is, of what happens in a pub, of what happens in a restaurant. Yeah. And so that is your frame of reference. Equally, you know, if I said to you, okay, it's, you have to go to court. Do you have a frame of reference for what happens in a court? For the kinds of people you meet there, for their roles, for the scope of their roles, for how you're supposed to behave, how you're supposed to interact, right? So that's sort of, it's a conceptual framing for an event. And then within that event, you have scripts linked to your expectations of what should happen in that particular domain, in that particular world, and what you should say and do. Yeah. So if you went into court and told the judge to feck off or worse, is that what would be expected? Is that the typical script? You're all going to say, well, we've never been in court. Well done. I once interpreted in a court case where the judge was being very kind to this deaf person who had had a lot of trouble in their lives. And they kept bringing him back for, you know, sort of 6 monthly, they call them in court, they call it coming back for mention, or coming back for a check-in and to see where we're going to go next. And this judge was very kind and decided that they would hear this person's case in camera. Do you know what in camera means? It means confidentially, in private. So it's a closed court. Nobody can come in and observe, because normally you've got open court, right, for cases that are being heard. So if a case is held in closed court or in camera, it means that the judge is going to try and, for some reason, preserve the privacy and the confidentiality of the case and the person or persons involved. So in this case, the deaf person had, you know, the judge was being really, truly going beyond the beyond and being kind to this person. And the deaf person just wasn't having any of it. And they were spiraling. They were having a lot of terrible difficulties in their life. And they told the judge to fuck off, quote unquote. So I, as the interpreter, had to tell the judge. So how do you do that, right? Because now we're kind of moving into interpreting. So hold the interpreting bit for a minute. But how would that play out if you're in court and somebody who is the accused tells the judge where to go do it? That is not in the script for court interaction, right? Because in a courtroom, the judge is king or queen. You've got the court clerk. You may have a stenographer. You have a witness box. You may or may not have a jury. You've got your prosecutor. You've got the defense team, right? They all have their places in the court, and they all have their turns that are going to be taken in a particular way. And there are rules governing the interaction. And if somebody breaches the rules, they'll be told by the judge, or there'll be an objection made by the other side. Yeah, and there'll be an intervention. And if you do the wrong thing, you can be held in contempt. Well, in this case, the judge sent the guy to Mountjoy for 6 months. So it's not, moral of the story, don't tell a judge where to go themselves. That's the moral of the story. So coming back to it though, there are frames and scripts, right? So we've got the frame of reference, you know what you're getting into, you have an idea, but then there are scripts. So going back to the restaurant piece, right? If I said to you, okay, you're going to a restaurant, what happens? You arrive at the door and go, Gillian.
You wait politely and to be seated or something, or
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then what happens?
Again, you wait for them to come over to you and you ask them, or you tell them what you need, what you're looking for.
Yeah, yes. So there's an interaction, there's a waiter role,
yeah.
There's the person being served role, Yeah, there's the, okay, you know, there's the menu bit, maybe. Who knows what this will be like post-COVID, right? So there's a menu bit, and you do your order, they take a note, they go away, you chat, you know to expect to wait for a bit, they'll come back, you know, you have an idea of, oh, it's too long, so let me get their attention and say, I'm sorry, I'm in a terrible hurry, where's my food, right? And it's all very polite. Yeah, so you've got that ordering. What happens if you go to McDonald's?
You go up, order yourself, and then take it away, wait, then take it away and sit down. Yeah.
Okay.
It's a different system.
So it's a different script.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's still all coming within the frame of restaurant. But within our heads, we can go restaurant, what kind of restaurant? Yeah. In the same way, if you're a lawyer, you can go court, frame, different kinds of courts, family court, civil court, district court, circuit court, high court, supreme court. Yeah, you know that there are going to be different kinds of scripts. There may be that you call the judge something different, or that there are going to be more people involved, or there are going to be slightly different rules of engagement, or that there's a higher degree of evidence required. You know, so there are going to be different scripts applied to each of those environments. And this is, you know, this is true for all of us in every interaction. So if you walk into the deaf club, again, post-COVID, if you went into the deaf village, what's the script? How many of you have been to the deaf village? Okay, so some of you, it feels like a long, long time ago, far, far away. Well, one of the scripts is if you go in, that you don't go in speaking. Yeah, because that's going to be really rude. Luna.
Myself and Kira, back in first year, they had a deaf play on. It was all deaf people, and we went in, and I think we were the only hearing people there, and we were shitting ourselves because we sat down at the table and everyone just started signing, but they had this whole script. It was I don't know, they started like arguing at the table and just being like, there's only 10 allowed in, and tried to send, was it Alvine, I don't know, someone home anyway. And she was like, I'm not leaving. Myself and Kira were like, is this part of the play? Like, no, it couldn't be. And then it was really interactive, like, and we were just sitting there for the whole thing going, oh my God. And we were there going, oh my God, that was amazing. We were able to understand the whole thing, and we're only in first year. It was amazing, but it was also a bit scary.
Okay, so, but that's the other bit, right? So now you're moving into intercultural interaction. And so you can't presume when you're in a new culture or in a new system that the frames and scripts that hold in your source language or culture will carry across directly. There may be some points of overlap, but what's considered politeness may differ. You know, I think if anybody has been to Asia, you know, this gesture means come here, not go away. Yeah. So you're thinking, well, what do? You know, what about cultures where, you know, a head shake or a head bob is used? What do you do? Like, do you mimic it, or is that going to be considered insulting and disrespectful? What do you do? Like when you're in the deaf club, do you sign and speak? Do you speak? Do you just sign? Do you introduce yourself to people? Do you wait to be introduced by someone? What's the script around introductions, right? So there are sort of the cultural things that then get mapped onto the discourse norms and how do you behave. So this is where we start to see the socio-cultural piece coming in, and the sociolinguistics as well. So other things, right, that you've got to bear in mind in discourse is you've got pragmatically a thing called inferencing. And so this might be where, you know, somebody says, oh, it's really cold in here with that window open. It's not just an observation. What that is a prompt to, will somebody close the window? Yeah. Or it could be, you know, oh, you know, you've got a terrible cold. That might not just be an observation. It might be step away from me because I don't want that cold. Yeah. So you got to be able to read between the lines. And then you also, for us, for ISL users, you've got to think about, well, how is inferencing expressed in a sign language? When is something stated, but then there's sort of, we've talked about invisible surrogates, but now we're going to talk about there's invisible intent. There's these inferences that you have to draw from what is said or not said. So come back to, my example earlier when Alissa was here, if a deaf person says to another deaf person, you're hearing, what's the inference there? It's not a literal reading of you can hear. It is an inference that you are betraying the cultural norms that I would expect from another deaf person. That's kind of heavy. Yeah, but that's the inference that you're deriving. And equally, if a deaf person says to you, oh my God, you're deaf, it means that you're embracing the cultural norms that this community holds dear and respects. So I'm not going to show you the movie, but I'll just show you a little clip. Well, actually, not even a clip, just an Elan, just because you're all working in Elan. I'll show you a little Elan piece here. It's a still of Julianne Gillen, who works in Chime. But many years ago, she did this interview for us for one of our projects. And if we had time and we were in real life, so let me just look at the time. Oh my God, it's 11:40. If we were in real life and had more time, I would be saying to you, okay, what frames and scripts underline this piece of discourse? And what do you need to know about how deaf people talk about themselves to understand the comments made? So here's what she says, and she's signing it, but we don't have the video here today. So she says, some deaf people look up to those deaf people who attended mainstream education. They actually label them as hearing. So think about what we've just been saying. They're deaf, often profoundly deaf. They're strong signers. But some deaf people feel that the mainstreamed deaf people are, in inverted commas, above them. At the same time, some deaf people feel that they are better than or above mainstream deaf people. Indeed, many deaf people in the deaf community don't want mainstreamed deaf people to be on committees, is what she says. One example relates to offering advice. Those who do volunteer to participate in committees, so those mainstream deaf people who volunteer to participate in committees, are dismissed out of hand. Their views are not considered important. So what's going on there in terms of frames and scripts?
Well, it has kind of the idea of there being the two concepts of deaf. Well, yeah, but like deaf and hearing, but not in the terms of ideological, but more cultural. So you'd have that whole idea, but I don't know whether that's a script or.
So that's a frame, right? So
a frame, sorry, yeah, that's right. And then otherwise, then you'd also maybe have the script of the education system. And how kind of what the traditional roots are, or what at least the history of the roots of deaf people in Irish education system anyway. Would that be a script?
That would still be a frame.
Still be a frame, sorry.
No, you're right, but you've got multiple frames at work here, right? Because you've got what we would call comparative frames. So you've got like a hearing community perspective maybe, or a mainstream deaf perspective versus a deaf community perspective. Sort of we might call that a traditional deaf community perspective, because the deaf community is changing and has changed since we recorded this back in probably 2008, 2009, right? So this is community shift happening. So you've got those comparative frames around education and around what does it mean to be deaf. So you've got, as you said, like the ideological frame and the cultural frame, and you've got, okay, both of them have sign language in it. Like she says, you've got these mainstream deaf people who are fluent signers, but still for the old school deaf community, that's not always enough. Yeah. And then in terms of the discourse, you've also got the hearing and the deaf. Yeah. And you've got the hearing piece. So deaf people in the traditional deaf community labeling mainstream deaf people as hearing. yeah, versus how those mainstream deaf people might look at themselves and regard themselves. So again, you've got comparative frames, and you've got in terms of the discourse, there's the piece of, there's the language choices. And remember, we talked before how the language choices, the vocabulary choices, excuse me, can map to identity and your positionality. So are you positioned within one group? Do you position yourself within a group? Or do you conceptualize yourself as within a group? And then how does somebody else, maybe in the same group or another group, view you? And those things then, they impact also on things around identity. But in terms of this structure, you've got the some deaf people who attended mainstream. That's coming in first. It's coming in first, and it's being used as a counterpoint, right? So that's going to be what we call known information then. So we've got like the introduction of this as a theme. So you've got mainstream, and then you've got deaf community. And when you're talking about the deaf community, labeling them, you also have this shifting to the perspective of the deaf community with respect to the mainstream community. When you're in the mainstream community, you're going to have the perspective of the deaf community on the other side. Yeah. So you also have here more metaphors, but these are spatial metaphors. Yeah. You've got comparisons. That's a metaphor, right? So you're comparing one with another. She also will say, she says, some deaf people feel that mainstreamed deaf are above them. Yeah. So there's physical height as being better, being lower in space as being worse. Yeah. So there's a metaphor in space. Or she says, or some deaf people feel that they are better or above, right? Because she can talk about it's above, and you can do it in different ways. Like you could have it this way, it could be like looking down on, looking up to, right? So all of those things, they're embodying those metaphors of the kind that Alissa was talking about earlier on. So we've got that playing out in our discourse too. But what we were doing when we're thinking about discourse levels, we're also going to try and track how that unfolds over time, and how do you map a story? Yeah, how do you map a story? We've talked about those things. Now, you said you've talked about Isham, and I am very conscious that it's now coming up just past 11:45. You've talked about Isham. So we know then that you're going to think through the framework. I mean, it's a very basic framework, but it's very helpful and useful to think through what Bill Isham talked about: the who, the what, the where, the when, the why, and the how. And you think about in an ISL piece of discourse, what gets introduced first? So it can be the
when?
Sorry? When, absolutely. So
time,
you typically get a time frame or a topic, so the what. Yeah, so it could be, well, now, so that's a time marker. So now I'm going to talk about what, and then I'm going to tell you, right? I'm going to talk about Isham's message analysis. So you tend to get rhetorical questions occurring in discourse. Yeah, so it's like, I'm going to talk about what? Here's what I'm going to talk about. When did this happen? Let me tell you. Who was involved? Let me tell you. And depending on the degree of formality, you tend to find more or less rhetorical questions and their answers being presented. That's sort of one general trend. We call it a trend. It's not a rule, it's a trend. So that's the piece where register kicks in, right? Because you've talked before about register in terms of frozen, formal, consultative, informal, and intimate. Yeah, so you've got 5 registers. This is from a guy called Jews who published a paper called The 5 Clocks back in the 1960s, and that still tends to be used as one of the points of reference today. And then the other piece that we need to think about when we're thinking about discourse analysis is who's your target audience, right? So this is all about the pragmatics, because how you present something to kids is going to be different from how you present something to adults. If you're interpreting for an older deaf person, you'll want to think about who they are, what they know, what's their frame, what are their scripts, What vocabulary makes them most comfortable? Yeah. And do I then mirror that or not? Or do I ignore that completely and just do what I do regardless of who I'm talking to? It's really unusual because we tend to engage in, like, again, I don't know if Sarah has covered this idea with you, the idea of accommodation. So we accommodate to our interlocutors. So for example, who knows somebody with a telephone voice? Hello, hi, how are you? Or your work voice, yeah, versus your I'm with my mates in the pub voice, yeah, or in the coffee shop, whatever. So you know, we've got those. Or if you go for a job interview, yeah, versus I'm just having a laugh on WhatsApp and I'm calling my friends or leaving a voicemail. So the register that you use is also going to be informed by your target audience and who your interlocutor is, and you're going to engage with your interlocutor and accommodate to them. Or if you want, so that's, you know, when we want to make people feel comfortable, we tend to accommodate towards them, and ideally then people are accommodating towards each other, so we're co-creating a degree of intimacy or proximity. But there are places where people will deliberately not accommodate, either because they have strong beliefs about the correct way to use language, or if it's in a multilingual context, the language to be used. So you might go to, if you went to Belgium, if you went to the Flemish Parliament and spoke French, you wouldn't get a response in French on the whole, particularly if you were talking with Flemish pro-Flams people who really feel that French is for the Wallonian region of Belgium, it's for the French-speaking people, and you know, that should not be used here in our parliament. And so you get this distancing effect, you get that the opposite of accommodation, you get non-accommodation, right? So you can have that. You could try that out this week if you wanted to upset the apple cart at home. You could deliberately try to accommodate towards people who you interact with, or deliberately not accommodate. So if you went into the deaf club and you refused to sign or insisted on using signed exact English, that would be an example of non-accommodation. And as a result, you would probably be maybe less welcome than you would be if you used ISL, right? So again, it's about language ideologies, it's frames and scripts. So the scripts there is what's the appropriate thing to say or do in this context, and how do I structure it? So that's kind of the frame of reference that we're thinking about. Given the time, let's stop there and see if you have any questions. And I might just record some of the other stuff for you and put it into Blackboard so that we do a little catch up. Gillian.
Sorry, I have a question, but actually it's about one of the assignments. It's just it reminded me there when you said target audience. Did you say that the target audience for the wiki is kind of like teenage age, as in somebody who has no prior concept? That's fine, because I couldn't see it on the thing. I just wanted to make sure of that. Okay, grand, thanks.
Cool. Anybody else? Let me stop sharing that one. Any other thoughts, questions? Oh, good. We're done. Okay, well, no problem. If anybody has any questions about the Elan piece or the wiki, feel free to come join me on Tuesday. I'm putting aside an hour, so it's there for you. So feel free to share, save up your questions, or if you have something in draft form that you want me to have a look at, I'll have a look at it there. Okay, excellent. Okie dokie. Have a lovely rest of the day and have a nice weekend. Week 12, 2 more weeks left. Cool. Take care. Bye.
Thanks, Lorraine.